Welcome to Sanctuary, bringing you conversation and stories at the intersection of life and faith. This edition of Sanctuary is produced in cooperation with the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago.
Hello, I'm Nisan Chavkin, Executive Director of the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago. Welcome to the May edition of Sanctuary. Like the rest of the world, Chicago is now confronting the global COVID-19 pandemic. Terms like social distancing and self-quarantine are now part of our vocabulary, and so many of our everyday activities are altered. The religious communities of Metropolitan Chicago, like communities across the nation and around the world, have made dramatic changes. What changes have congregations made in order to slow the spread of this disease? How have these changes affected their members and the people they serve? And what can people of faith do to help their neighbors and stem the tide during this crisis? Joining me today to help answer these and other questions about the current pandemic are Drs. Allison, Commissioner of the Chicago Department of Public Health, and the Reverend Vance T. Henry, Chief of Faith Engagement, Office of the Mayor for the City of Chicago. Now, because we are doing our part to protect each other and the community at large, I'll be talking with each of our guests from across our set and in sequence. My first guest today is Dr. Awardy. Dr. Awardy, welcome to Sanctuary.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and we thank you in advance, and we will hopefully thank you again for all the work that you and your colleagues are doing on behalf of the residents of our city to help us all get back to normal. So I guess my first question is, where are we now?
Yeah, so the age-old question. We are absolutely making progress here in Chicago. And when I talk about making progress, the biggest part of that has to do with what our case numbers are looking like. We are still not on the other side of our curve. And you hear us talk a lot about flattening the curve. What that means is we really track how many new cases, how many new hospitalizations, and unfortunately how many deaths we are seeing related to COVID-19. And while there's a lot of transmission going on, we see that curve, that number of infections really rising quite quickly. Because of everybody staying at home, because of the social distancing and the hand washing and all of the important things that folks have been doing around Chicago, we have seen major slowing in terms of that infection rate. And so instead of the cases shooting up like this, the number of cases doubling every 2-3 days like they were a month and a half ago, we're now at a point where we're doubling, every couple of weeks, and maybe even getting flatter than that. And so we're getting to the point where we're going to start seeing those numbers, that increase really on the way back down, but we're not there quite yet. And so it can be frustrating, I think, for people who say, I just want things to get back to the way they were. Aren't we through this already? And I just want people to know that the fact that we're pushing out the time of this a little bit is because we've actually made good progress in flattening the curve. If we had seen that very rapid increase, say we'd continued on a rate where we were doubling cases every couple of days like we were in the beginning of March, we would have seen as many people here in Chicago die in a month as we typically see die in about 2 years. And so the fact that we have actually seen a point, we've still seen, hundreds of deaths, really many more, obviously, than anyone would want to see. But it's been a dramatic improvement in that. And as we slow that rise, it means that it actually pushes the peak a little bit later. And so the fact that, if we're talking about early May here, starting to be on the way back down, we need to make sure that we're on top of the spread of infection and very much on the way back down before we can really seriously think about being able to carefully open activities back up and open, I know mostly thinking about congregations and religious life, what that's going to look like moving forward.
So the fact that this peak keeps getting farther and farther in the future means that we're winning.
We're winning, exactly.
I see.
Exactly. We really, if we had a very steep rise, we might be on the other side right now, but we would have had many, many more deaths, and we would have overwhelmed our health system. You look at what happened in Italy, to an extent what happened in New York. One of the main reasons to slow that rise is to make sure that if people get sick, we have the hospital beds and the doctors and the nurses and the equipment that we need to actually help treat people and help save lives in that way. And so the fact that our hospitals, because of that flattening the curve, they're stretched, they're working hard, but there are absolutely beds available and ventilators available. And when people do get sick here in Chicago, they can get the world-class care that they need to give them the best chance to really be able to recover from this virus. That is important, and that is good news. So I know it's hard that we're having to really think about extending this a little bit longer, but you've heard the campaign of the city, stay home, save lives. That's not just rhetoric. Staying home, having fewer chances for infection, especially right now, has saved lives and will continue to save lives. And our goal is to save lives as we continue to carefully think ahead to being able to, of course, bring back all of the really important economic, social, faith interactions that are so important to our lives.
Now, I was watching your hand, so it went like this. It seemed real gradual as we get out of this.
Yeah.
So what is getting out of it? I mean, just looking ahead.
Right.
Do we flip a switch and go back? What happens?
Right, yeah, we don't flip a switch. And I know people wish that it would be like
Yes.
we would just, flick this on and off and say, we're back to normal. And, everybody can come back to church and everybody can completely go back to work and we can go back to hugging each other and we don't have to worry so much about this hand washing. And unfortunately, that's just not going to be the way that that's going to happen. Instead of thinking like a light switch, I want people to think more like a dimmer light, where we will be opening things up. We will be having sectors of the economy. We will have portions of work. We will think about how can we bring activities back that continue to have appropriate social distancing, that continue to have some of the things that, as you said right from the beginning, people have really learned about keeping 6 feet distance and doing hand washing and being safe, and wanting to make sure that as activities come back, we watch really carefully what is happening with our data, with our health system, with our testing, with positivity. We will see more infections as we open things back up. We don't have a vaccine yet, right? We don't have a dedicated treatment yet for COVID. And but what we want to be careful of is as we see some infections, they're not at a scale that we see our curve really get out of control. We don't run out of the possibility to treat people. And we make sure that we keep protecting the most vulnerable individuals and thinking about what that means in creative ways, I think is one of the main points. But the mayor, the Chicago Department of Public Health, the whole city is doing a lot of planning towards recovery, really thinking about what will stages of this look like. How do we make sure that, people who live paycheck to paycheck and may have jobs that might take longer to come back or might come back in different ways than they were? How do we think about supporting those individuals? How do we think about making sure that as we all are looking ahead towards vaccination and other things that will make it easier to open this up?
I think that's one of the questions for faith communities across the city, for our viewers, is to really get a handle. Right now, it's the ceiling, I think, is even for a funeral, it's only 10 people.
That's right.
And that's it. Congregations aren't doing, if they have the capacity, they're virtual.
Right.
They can't congregate. What
Right.
might the gradual opening up might look for congregations as they try to resume to go back to the things that make them congregations,
Right,
the people that they know and the traditions they love.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does that affect their let's start with their space, I guess.
Sure.
How many people can, when will we be able to even have 25 or 50 in a room?
And this is exactly the sorts, some of these sorts of details that will be coming out, especially once we're thinking beyond sort of that strict stay at home. There will continue to be limits on sizes of gatherings, probably for some time. But it will be thinking about, do you move from 10? Do you move? I mean, you think about how we came into this, even though it was very fast, right? We started at, I think 500 and 250 and 50 and 10. And I think in that same way, it'll be in phases. We won't want to sort of think about each sector individually. It'll probably be a sense where, as a whole city, we're thinking about what level are we at, right? And we'll be announcing over the next week or two some more details about how we'll be thinking as a city. Where are we in terms of being able to open settings? But yeah, I think there will continue to be some limits on sizes of gathering, and importantly, there will continue to be needs for thinking about social distancing. There will continue to be needs for thinking about our most vulnerable individuals. And when I think about the faith community, and I know, we have a lot of especially older Chicagoans who faith and that really interpersonal interaction is such an important part of their lives. I want to make sure that they can be as connected as they can. But I also, where I look at our data here, right, and we know that as has been true around the world, being older is a really significant risk factor for the getting a severe case of COVID or unfortunately dying. You look at our deaths so far here in Chicago, and only about 18% of our population is over the age of 60. But you look at our deaths, and I just pulled the data from today, and it's more than 3/4 of the deaths have been in people over 60. You look at people over 70, that's only about 8% of our population, but it's about 60% of the deaths.
Yeah, and as you point out, this is the cruel irony of this
Right.
disease is that faith communities are, so much of their central core is helping those in need.
Yes.
Whether they lack for services or whether they lack for
Yes.
companionship, or whether they, just a place where people go, and that's the place where people turn across the spectrum. That's what communities do, and here our most vulnerable are being told to stay away.
That's right. And that's where, I've been so pleased to see a lot of congregations and faith leaders really in creative ways think about how to maintain that connection and maintain that support, especially for some of these folks who really are at the most risk for the severe illness. So we've seen, obviously faith communities regularly think about connection. And so it's been having to think about how do you do this in a way that isn't physically bringing people together. So we've certainly seen the move to technology, but also the old-fashioned, the calling trees and the buddies, and how are we making sure that in a proactive way we're reaching out to people who may be living alone or maybe older and may have some of these very, beyond the spiritual needs, also having some really practical, food needs or healthcare needs, and really helping to serve as that conduit, and then bringing real information too. I know that faith leaders in Chicago have opportunities to bring real science-based information to people in a way that I may not have that same reach. And so I've really appreciated the work that I know a lot of our faith leaders have done just to make sure that they're sharing with their congregations the real information about how to protect themselves.
Well, let's close there. We've got about a minute until we take our break. But where can faith leaders turn for that current information, both online and other sources that they can get regular updates? I know there's lots of wonderful websites and things, but you have to go find them. Is there something we can sign up for email or phone calls or something?
Yes.
Where do we go?
Yeah, so for the city of Chicago, I would always point people to chicago.gov/coronavirus. And on that page, every single day we update it. Right up at the top, you can get the latest data with all kinds of details about geography and cases and testing. But also, we have some specific guidance on there for faith leaders and for community members, and there are ways to sign up for email alerts and text alerts. So individual people can sign up to get those, or community or congregations can share that. And then similarly, I would point people to the CDC. CDC.gov/coronavirus also has some information that's up to date at a more national level, including that is specifically designed for religious communities. And then I know a lot of the denominations and a lot of the faiths have put together their own information. But for Chicago, I would really point you to that website. Get on the email list, have people sign up for the text alerts.
That's just great. I want to thank you, Dr. Allwordy, for joining us today and for all your efforts on behalf of the city and our country. And encourage our viewers to stick around, for in a moment We'll be joined by the Reverend Vance T. Henry, Chief of Faith Engagement for the office of our mayor here in the city of Chicago.
Metropolitan Chicago is one of the most religiously diverse areas in the world, and for more than a half century, Sanctuary has reported and reflected on our faith-filled community. Sanctuary tells stories of faith from both inside our houses of worship to the streets and neighborhoods where faith is acted out every day with acts of kindness and concern. From food pantries to peace initiatives, from worship services to servicing the poor, Sanctuary has a proud history of reporting on the goodness that flows from our faith traditions. Watch Sanctuary every Sunday at 12 noon on the Live Well Network.
Welcome back to Sanctuary, where we are discussing the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on the world, our nation, the city of Chicago, and in this segment, how the pandemic is affecting our faith communities. Joining us for this portion of the program is the Reverend Vance T. Henry, Chief of Faith Engagement, Office of the Mayor for the City of Chicago. Vance, it's good to see you again, and welcome to Sanctuary.
Thank you, Nisan. It's so good to see you as well.
We are very thrilled that you're here, and thank you for your service. And we're looking for a sense of what our faith communities, how are they coping? They have been asked to make so many dramatic changes to essentially their fundamental activities of being in community. And now, so much of it they can't do. How are they coping? What are they doing? How are they responding?
Yeah, Nisan, that's a great question. Just to be very frank and honest, it's tough. I've often had to, as you've seen in these last several months and weeks, as the social distancing rules have changed, I've often had to be the bearer of the news with regards to it going from 100 to 50, and then within 24 hours it dropped to 10.
Yeah.
And so it's been tough, and that's because faith communities, by definition, so much of the energy, so much of the focus of the community is the idea of togetherness. And the very fact that coronavirus strikes at that, people's ability to be together and to, as I heard Dr. Allwordy mention, celebrate their faith traditions. Just to be honest, it's been tough. But notwithstanding that, I've seen faith communities move very nimbly and do extraordinary work in the midst of figuring out what this new normal is, to figure out how to leverage technology to do some of the traditional things that they do. There are communities who are still feeding. There are communities who are still reaching out to the more vulnerable among us, doing well-being checks. And so the faith community is having to really kind of redefine itself while still being consistent with the things that are core to its mission, which is really at the end of the day, and I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and what he said, I think, is true of many religious traditions. But Bonhoeffer said, I think, the church ceases to be the church when it ceases to focus on others and the care of others. And I think that kind of ethos is true of our faith community. And so I think some of what's going on, just to be honest, is a redefining of what that means in this new day of defining the new normal. What is this new normal as things change so much?
So tell us about some of that nimbleness with technology. How are congregations, how do you run a service when nobody's in the sanctuary? How do you feed people when you can't see them or touch them? How do you care for people, give them beds when you can't have more than a couple people in the same place? How does that work?
We're building the plan and we're flying it.
Okay.
And what that is mean, so I'm thinking, I won't say the name, but I think of one pastor who called me a couple weeks ago, and he was really struggling with this question because weekly, because of the neighborhood, the vulnerable neighborhood he serves, they feed 400 a week.
Yeah.
And so what he was trying to do, as he's not far from a police station where there's traffic up and down his street, was, Vance, I don't want to, get on anybody's radar, and I'm trying to figure this out. So I can't tell the people not to come, But if I have them separated 6 feet apart, and if I have my staff put on, face covering, and we use sanitizer, will that help to meet the standard? And I said, yes. He said, I can't believe I'm doing this. I said, Pastor, the fact that you are trying to figure this out and you're being creative is the moment that we're in. And so I just thank God that you're not turning those people away, because where would they go? Yeah. Where would 400 people go who are in need of food in a time like this, where many of them are food insecure, which is why you do it. We have other pastors who've gone, who have services of a couple thousand, who are now online. Mm-hmm. And I regularly are talking to pastors across all faiths that are having to figure out, how do I communicate the message of our faith tradition in this day where I don't have the call and response, I don't have the laughter, the engagement. And so some of this is just, to be honest, is tough. But I see pastors stepping up and being nimble and doing it, and that did not have an online presence, that have an online presence, and their membership has increased significantly. And these people are giving more.
Well, that is an important element that I wanted to also touch about, because so many, millions of people are filing for unemployment, millions of people are furloughed, and churches, depending where you are, faith communities of all kinds, congregations from Anglican to Zoroastrian, they are membership organizations in terms of either tithing or regular membership and so on. And if your congregation doesn't have the resources to give, how does the institution continue? Whether it's a mosque or a synagogue or a temple or a church or whatever, how do they keep going? How are faith institutions handling their finances in this extraordinary economic situation?
Yeah, and I just, to be honest again, in this time, it's tough because so much of what happens in houses of worship, by the way of the giving, happens when a faith leader stands up, and there are other people who are a part of that effort, and there's a basket that is sent down an aisle, or people stand up and they circle around. Well, in this day of defining the new normal, as pastors and the imams are being nimble, several of them have told me that they're actually calling individual people, and just as they are checking in on them, they're saying, hey, let's make sure we continue our focus on our family of faith and the community in which we serve. And to be able to do that, it's important that we continue our giving. And so pastors and the faith leaders are actually just being very direct about it. And, to many of their credits, it's interesting that they're seeing giving going up. And then just, again, being frank, there are other congregations. I had a very frank conversation with one of our leaders who has several religious organizations under him. He wondered how many of those institutions may or may not be able to come back.
Right. It's a
sobering.
It's a very sobering challenge. In my observations, and I'm curious for your perspective, because you see so many more congregations and traditions across the city. But my sense is, from watching and listening to every community, the Sikh community, the Baha'i community, the Zoroastrian community, the Muslim, the Jewish, all these different traditions, that people have been very candid, that it has been a time of frankness and people really working hard to say this is what's really happening, both in terms of the information they're trying to convey, because they are religious leaders are in the habit of trying to be truth tellers, which is important.
That's right.
But also in terms of being able to say this is what we're facing. This is why we need your help, and this is why the people we serve need your help. And if you could just tell us about how that is, that message. That's my impression. Is that yours as well?
Yeah, it is. And as I hear you define leadership, which is truth telling, I think it's in this moment where. And I don't want speak out of turn, but I think one of the things that is so definitive and so distinctive about the faith community in a time where we're not hearing the kind of truth that we need to hear, as we as a society have to make hard decisions about our family's economics, our social mobility or lack thereof, is that faith leaders are telling the truth and being frank with their leadership and being frank with the communities that they serve. As you heard Dr. Allwoody talk about, I can't imagine what the city of Chicago would have been able to do given the quickness of how this has come in. And as you mentioned, you referenced the tsunami. If we had not been able to leverage our relationships with faith communities, who we told the truth to, and who we challenged to tell the truth to their congregations, their temples, their mosque, in a time that it was very difficult because we were just learning about what COVID meant. And so I'm very encouraged that particularly in Chicago, we have the kind of religious community and leaders who do tell the truth. And because of that, I believe lives were saved.
That's good. We have about a minute or so as we close. I just wanted to ask, what can people in the congregation, ordinary members of faith, what can they do to help this effort? And frankly, what can they do to help their leadership, which is under an enormous strain?
Yes.
What can we do? And just a quick wrap up there.
You know, I think it's Dr. King that helps us here. He said life's most urgent and persistent question is, what are we doing for others? And I think that is at the heart of what many of our faith traditions are really about. It's the idea of the care of my neighbor. Mm-hmm. And if we could just do that and do that well, and I think that's the measure. That's a measure of faith. How are we caring for our neighbors? How are we checking in on the more vulnerable in our mm-hmm. temples, our synagogues, our mosques? Are we making sure that someone who we know has mobility issues or not access to transportation, are we bringing them food? Mm-hmm. Maybe helping them get to a doctor's appointment. Mm-hmm. So I think the idea here is caring for our neighbors. Right. And in that, as you mentioned, I think as I think about, and I think about some of the conversations, frank conversations I've had with religious leaders, it's caring for our leaders. And oftentimes some of the more burdened people in congregations are religious leaders. Yes. And who often don't feel like they can turn to anyone. And so if members of faith communities could just check in on their leaders and saying, praying for you, mm-hmm. I think that's the measure of our faith. How are we caring for each other in this moment?
Thank you, Vance. I wish to thank Reverend Henry for joining us today. And again, thank Dr. Allwoody and for your dedication.
Thank you.
And to our faith communities. I want to thank our viewers for watching Sanctuary. Please stay safe and reach out to friends and family as best you can in these challenging times.